before we even get to the grief part, there is first the experience of the loss or the shift. And that is actually what has brought you to this point. So, what is it that you've either lost, either through death, or maybe the loss of a job, or maybe a divorce, maybe the loss of a pet, and or a shift as far as something as a shift in the economy.
Hello and welcome back to Ignite 180. I'm your host, Sharita Santiago, and I'm excited to have each and every single one of you here again for our conversation on this week. We're going to be touching on loss, grief, and transition. Today, I have with me none other than Miss Rosalind Price. She is the founder and CEO of R. Richard Price Consulting. She's a grief coach and change strategist. Roz, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here. I know it can be a challenging and tough topic, but I know this is going to be a beneficial conversation, and more importantly, making sure that we have the space to show the human aspect of this and ensuring that we're all more grief educated and grief supported as we go through our transitions of life. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Excellent. Yes, I'm excited to delve into this topic. And one of the reasons I wanted to dig deep into the idea of grief, loss, transition is, as you know, we've been looking at the media. We've seen lots of things happen in our nation where change and transition has been heavily pressed upon us in a way that most of us have not ever experienced. We've had this also happen in our family, our household, in our own communities. So what I want to do is first anchor this conversation in and around meaning making for our audience to kind of speak to what grief is. So I'd like to begin the meaning of grief and what it means to experience grief.
Excellent question. So, Sharita, I'd like to start by first saying that I'm not only a grief coach and a change and transition strategist, I'm also a grief navigator myself. So when I'm speaking about these things, it's not just from the expert lens of going through the training and the certification and coaching clients and colleagues and even personal relationships, but also having gone through it myself since I was 4 years old. So when we talk about grief, I like to segment it out by first talking about, before we even get to the grief, there is first the experience of the loss or the shift. And that is actually what has brought you to this point. So what is it that you've either lost, either through death, or maybe the loss of a job, or maybe a divorce, maybe the loss of a pet, and or a shift as far as something as a shift in the economy that we've been talking about. Maybe a shift with family dynamics and your child going off to school, a physical shift, right? A loss in capability and ability. And then as you are facing with the loss, the second part is when you're accepting and facing that, then there is the decision to actually begin to grieve. And I like to describe grieving as actually a state of being. That's when you have accepted the loss, you're starting to navigate through some of those tactical things, but when you start to actually grieve, you're really starting to meet the emotions behind it, as you are also shifting into some of the behavior shifts in which you are landing or finding yourself as a result of the loss or shift. So you're dealing with possibly the anger, the sadness, even if it is a loss that you anticipated or maybe you instigated yourself, there are still emotions behind that. It might have been something, say, for instance, if there was a decision you made to actually divorce your spouse or whomever, or to separate from a relationship, although you might have been the one that triggered that, there is still emotion behind that, whether it's disappointment, there might be some relief. It still requires something for you to meet and focus on to make sure that you have the nurture and support you need. Then the third aspect of that is after you're going through what I call a season of grieving, where you're meeting that and you're in that state of being, then you become adaptive to, if you're doing it in a healthy and holistic way, you become adaptive to embracing grief as a natural companion on your journey. Because
Mm.
as we all know, that life is transitions. And so as a part of transitions, sometimes there is a grief and loss in the transitions that we go through in life. As you stated, death just so happens to be one of them, but there are other transitions that we go through, and there are transitions in between the transitions. So, what I always support people to say is that grief, while we like to say that grief is lifelong and never ends, what I like to reframe it and name it is that it is a companion. Grief is a state of awareness, and it opens up the space, not just for nurture and healing, but it opens up the space for us to have a transformative experience in our own self awareness, enlightenment, our own self identity and transformation, and then where we open up the space for empathy and compassion for others.
Yeah, that's good. I wanted to clock back just a bit and thinking about the idea that in many instances, I know from a personal experience, and I love the idea that you shared in the very beginning that not only are you a grief coach and that you are a change strategist, but you also have experienced these things yourself. In my walk, in my journey, of course, just like every other human being, we are connected to those around us, but I never associated grief with the loss or change or transition. For example, losing a pet. I shared with you a little earlier in a private conversation that I lost my dog, and before I became a pet person, his Cesaro is back here on my bookshelf. But like losing him was, of course, it happened, and we were sad. But then the grief struck at times where I most least expected it. It would hit me when I was eating dinner or driving in the car or smelling a certain scent. One of the things I'd like you to talk about for those who are not just experiencing grief and transition due to loss of life, what are the feelings they might see, like being unmotivated or dealing with anger? Can we go back a little bit and add some names to some of the emotions that we might see before we transition into our next question?
Awesome question. Yeah. So a couple of the experiences that you just described first is an understanding of what type of grief it is you're dealing with. So when we talk about things such as the loss of a pet, it's disenfranchised grief. Those are the types of grief and loss where society, it's not a societal norm to grieve over those type of transitions and losses, or people tend to minimize them and not truly understand that there are connections in
Mm,
those losses. Those pets, they are creatures, they're living creatures, and you've created bonds. Perhaps there are special moments in how you came to have that pet, what that pet meant to you as far as protection, another family member, so to speak. So we first have to name the type of grief that you're going through so that you understand actually what it is you're going through, so then you can start to name the feelings around it and then start to make meaning making. Then there's also the ambiguous grief. A lot of times that's described when we go through divorce, even the grief of, say for instance, when there's the traumatic loss of someone that's missing. And the ambiguous grief is like it's there, but it's not touchable, it's not tangible. When you go through a divorce or loss of a partner through separation, the person is still there, they're still alive, but you no longer have that same connection that you had before. You no longer have that partnership. The way in which you go about life now in a day to day is no longer there. Waking up to seeing that person, things that you used to do together, and even the grief and losses you described of the hopes and dreams that you anticipated. Nobody goes into relationships thinking that we're going to get a divorce. So
yes.
there's that. Then there's the third part of it, that there's also that self identity or identity grief. Who am I now as a result of this covenant is no longer here? And what does that mean for me? I was a wife, or I still see myself as a wife. However, I'm shifting out of that. And others may see me as that as well. So to answer your question is, first name it, what type of grief it is. Even your loss of career or a shift in career or loss of a job, that's a form of a disenfranchised grief, or
Mm,
even an ambiguous grief. It's still there, but it's no longer there in the same capacity or familiarity that you have. That, and then the emotions around that could actually be Sometimes when those types of grief are not a norm, they're
Mm.
often overlooked. So there could be an absent grief where you just kind of go on about things as if it's not happening. And it might seem that you're avoiding it, but that's because you've been trained this is not a big deal, or why are you grieving that? So there's that type of grief. There's the other types of grief that we don't talk about, or feelings such as cumulative grief, right? So that's the
Mhm.
grief that, as a result of, like, if my relationship has shifted or if my career has shifted, I might also have some financial impacts to that. Dynamics and relationships may happen. So you might have some sadness. There's an emotion there, sadness from those disconnections or those shifts there. You might also have the types of feelings of longing,
Mm.
so that person, or just that being there, that pet, you might have a sense of longing. There also may not be emotions, but there might be some things that come out in your behavior, in your physicality, that may be tied to your grief. So it's a whole gamut of things. Like, you may not be angry with the other person, but you may be angry that this has ended for you, that this has shifted for you, that there's something that you've got to shift and change and to do anew. So it's all types of emotions behind that.
You hold two hats. So you have the hat of a grief coach and a change strategist. Can you walk us through what you experienced if you took that hat off and you had to utilize what you now know as a coach in your individual process? Can you give us an example of what you experienced in your own life, your own story, and how you walked through that? What tools did you wish you had in the process of dealing with grief? How did you reflect on it? What might prepare you in the process of experiencing? Well, I don't think there's anything that can prepare you, but maybe you have another perspective on that. So that's why you're here today. So if you could just kind of walk us through your process and your experience.
Yeah, so I'll make it brief, but try to make some meaning of it, and connect it right to present days. So when I was 4 years old, my mom was diagnosed with a terminal disease that progressed. Okay, she didn't pass away until I was 16. At that time, I didn't realize, though, that not only was I dealing with anticipatory grief, because in the back of my mind, I was like, at any given day, she could pass away, she could die. But, and also at the same time, because her physicality was changing, her physical abilities were changing, I didn't know I was also dealing with ambiguous grief. So I was dealing with all of that, and I didn't have the tools back then. So, Sharita, to answer your question, back then I grew up in a household that was very religious and full of faith. And while it was a great foundation for me that has led me to some of my strengths and abilities today, it also wasn't helping me with the reality of the situation. And so I didn't have the tools, I didn't have the language, and then therefore I was not able to put together, or no one around me was able to put together a strategy of holistic support for me to actually be able to deal with those different levels of grief, while also making the most meaning of the time that I had with my mother, which she did innately. However, I do wish that I would have had a better understanding that could have been communicated to me at that age, in my mindset at that age, where I could have been able to navigate even a little bit more swiftly. Because what it made me do was, yes, I gained more empathy and I made more meaning and time with my mom, but at the same time, I was soldiering up. I started to become soldiered up. I was becoming a survivor, not a thriver and a navigator. So now you bring that to today, between that time and where I am now, I'm 51, about to be 52. I've had lots of cumulative losses in between and grief. But along the way, I've gathered skills and tools. And so what it has made me is more savvy in how I navigate grief. And one of those things that I've done is to actually face it, to
Mm.
meet it. Sometimes when we use the word faith, sometimes it's a blind faith, and sometimes it is used for us to kind of ignore what's actually going on. And you have the hope that something's going to be how you want it to be. But sometimes that faith is actually that this may not be what I want it to be. However, I do have the tools and the strength to be able to navigate it through it in a healthy way. So,
Mm,
three of the things that I picked up along the way, Sharita, that has been the best thing for me that I apply and that I also help people with is that I find the quiet in grief.
mm,
And when I find the quiet and grieve, then I'm able to actually really deal with what's going on, listen to my voice, kind of quiet the voices around me and their projections and their perspective, although well intended. But I'm trying to really deal with those emotions that you talked about. What is it that I'm feeling? And then I'm seeking for the answers of that. And then what I do is I take solitude. I know there is a lot of times we know that there is a benefit, right, of having
mhm.
support around us and people around us. And you should look for that and you should have that. However, we also have to garner and gain an appetite for solitude and feed that appetite. Because what's happening is, then you're able to hear yourself, you're able to answer some questions or identify where you do need the best support for yourself, and then you are also getting yourself ready to go into your new normal because you are transforming and expanding even into a greater version of yourself. And then after that, you're able to build your strategy around how you're going to go into your new normal and what you need in order to do that.
That's good. I really appreciate the anticipatory grief. As we age, you said you were 51. I'm turning 45 this year. And thinking about like with myself aging, there's some things that when I look at the faces of those who are my elders, that they aren't going to be around. And that is just the reality, of our living. And I was not aware that there was even a strategy to anticipate someone potentially leaving here, for those who are caring with ailing parents, ailing senior parents, ailing individuals who may be preparing to make a transition as a result of a terminal illness or something abrupt. Sometimes we have families in hospice who are still really trying to work through what this life looks like when that other person is no longer there. So I love the idea and concept around anticipatory strategies to kind of prepare yourself to move forward. When I think about grief, I think about sometimes how grief is sneaky. And, how I remembered preparing for my cousin slash godmom, her funeral. I remember being on and helping to do things and engaging. And I really felt like, wow, I'm not as sad as I probably should be because I really loved her. And I didn't understand why I was not sad until one day I'm sitting and then it just out of nowhere just hit me, and the idea of just kind of like figuring out now, how do I process what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing this in this moment, and how to manage that became heavy. I wrote a training called Leading Under Construction for those of us who are either overachievers or leading in a household with children, dealing with death, dealing with work, dealing with school, dealing with bills, household, you name it, I'm responsible for it. And it's all being carried on the weight of my shoulders. How do we balance or counterbalance the dealing with grief and life at the same time?
I love this question. So I know you're recording and we're timed, so I'm going to really try to keep it brief, but I think it requires so much depth. And I think this is where I'm hoping folks will have a light bulb moment.
Mm-hmm.
So grief can be sneaky, as we call it. I even put in one of my manuals, tricky, it can be tricky and complex. However, and what I like to say is that grief is not necessarily sneaky or tricky. Grief is sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Grief is sophisticated and comes with its own, how do I say this? It comes with its own power of enlightenment, yet at the same time, it is so challenging because of its complexities. And I will say to you, Sharita, when we ask the question of how do we balance that, is the quick answer is get comfortable with grief.
Hmm.
You notice that I said grief is a companion earlier in the earlier questions. Get comfortable with grief. We're comfortable with joy.
Hmm.
We invite peace. We long for peace, right? We are so happy to have happiness. That's what we thrive for, right? And we should. Contentment. Those are all things that we invite. But the one uninvited guest is grief. We do not want grief. Grief, you stay
Mm,
over there, you stay away from me. And when you creep up on me, let me know
yeah.
because I got to be in control of this, or don't creep up on me at all. But we
Hmm.
have to get comfortable with grief. So, one of the ways that I balance that is so before, right, even though I knew my mother was passing, it still was, it didn't creep up on me. I was prepared for it, didn't make it any easier.
Hmm.
And then as I was dealing with cumulative grief, right, grief started to become the norm, but not the norm in the sense where I started to become numb to it. I started to want to get familiar with grief. Grief, who are you? Why are you here? What is it that you're trying to show me? What are you trying to lead me to? And then what's the lesson in the relationships that I have formed? So my answer to that is get comfortable with grief.
Hmm.
Grief, I allow grief to walk with me and I walk with grief. And I
Hmm.
know that's like people are like, why are you smiling? Because when I do that, grief doesn't sneak up on me. Grief
Hmm.
becomes my companion and we're in sync. So grief is saying to me, uh-oh, that might be a trigger for you. And is it a trigger that is something you need to address? Or is it a trigger that's something that you need to embrace? That it is something, a memory or a longing that is healthy for you? Or is it something that you need to focus on and manage? So the balance comes in first, not befriending grief. Because I try not to be that toxic positivity,
Yes.
but because I just that drives me crazy, Sharita. It really does. Like I'm the person in between. Don't be negative and don't be overly positive. Let's deal with the reality, right? And let's reframe it to what makes sense for our unique journeys. Grief is a companion. It ain't going nowhere. It's a part of life. And really, it does not always have to be this negative thing. Grief is a teacher.
Hmm. So, and grief and loss are paired. And I believe in what I hear you sharing is that what we're experiencing is a normal part of this process. That change and transition will forever and always be with us.
As long as
So
you're breathing.
okay. Yeah. So being prepared to navigate that landscape of grief is something that we are all responsible for being able to handle. Now, let me ask you this. When I was a kid, I remember I have grandparents. My mom was a younger mother, so I hung around the old folks, the old saints, a whole lot. And I remember my grandfather losing like his first cousins and some others. And so when you talked about like the ability to endure, like what you were mentioning, I like to akin to the fruit of the spirit, like long suffering. But grief when I was a child, it was sad because I could sense that other people were sad. I had a very long bout in my life where no one disappeared. Like everyone was here. I've not lost my mother, blissfully. My biological father and my stepdad, both are still alive. Um, I've experienced the loss of some very dear friends of mine who've transitioned. I want you to speak to the individual listener who's not gone through the experience in a trivial or trying way. I want to touch on those who have not yet had a loss. I come from a massive family. We have so many cousins and aunties and uncles on both sides of my family. So losing people is bound to happen.
Mhm.
But for those individuals who have a much smaller circle, maybe have not lost anyone yet, how might they prepare? And I know it seems a little strange when we're talking about things like death, but even if we include some other of the other things we talked about, like divorce, job loss, change, losing a pet, all the other things, how might they prepare themselves mentally? Like if you could give us one or two just kind of basic principles around that preparation for those who've never experienced it or never experienced it in a way that shifted the dynamic of the way that they continued their journey.
Yeah, I don't know, to your point, if they could actually prepare for it or if they could be more or less aware of it.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
It's an awareness. And the preparation, you can prepare all day, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
said, my mother packed in, in the 16 years that I was with her and she with me, she packed in a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But she could still never prepare me for the aftermath. If that
Yes.
makes sense,
Yes, it
So
does.
what happens now when my dad is dealing with his grief and how his behavior shifted because his grief is inhibited,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that it's, suppressed, right? He's showing us that he's grieving by his behavior and his actions, and he's verbalizing it, but not really. He's soldiering up and he's just going about life. And as I told you, because I was kind of taught soldier up, I wasn't prepared for the fact that you were soldiering up and you're going about life and you're also providing for yourself. You're 16. So, Sharita, guess what's happening in that time? Grief aside, I'm graduating high school. I'm
Mm-hmm.
becoming a woman in my own right. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to major in, friends, dating, boyfriends, all of that. I don't know that you can actually prepare for it. I
Yes.
think it becomes an awareness. Then
Mm-hmm.
that and when you are more aware of it, then you build a curiosity for it. And then you start to build a knowledge of it. And then therefore you can start to gain tools because knowledge is one of the tools. And then you start to gather those things. So in the event that it does come, it's not like a total shock because it's not something that you totally do not know. You may not have experienced it, but you have an awareness of it. And I think awareness is a big thing. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in that helps you then to start to put the bullet points together of what you need to prepare. The other thing is that if you have never experienced that, here's the thing about this human experience. You have people with you on the journey.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
while you may not have gone through it, you've got veterans like myself. I always say this like this is not a calling that I would have chosen. However, I do not run from it. I
Yeah.
am the queen of transitions. So you have veterans like myself, you have veterans like you. There are other people here to help you. So don't grieve in silence. Do
Mm.
not do that in silence. And one way to prevent that is that when you have an awareness of what loss, transitions, grieving, grief, all of those things, when you have an awareness of it and you're not hiding from it, you may not be able to define it, but you have somebody that's along with you that can help you define it for yourself and then help provide you with the tools.
Excellent, excellent. So, what we're going to do, this is part one of our loss, grief, and transition segment. We're going to jump back in part two with Miss Rosalind Price, who's going to talk to us and walk us through change, loss, and grief in and around the loss of or the impact of loss of opportunity in the workforce. So, do you have any final words as we wrap up this segment?
I will say this. So, in your preparation, because I loved that last question, and I just have to kind of pull on it even more. One example when I tell you that, so not only do I coach other people, but I've been able to help my son. So, my stepson lost his father. We lost his father. And I hate to use the word loss. His father transitioned from this life into his what I call limitless being in 2022. He had never faced that, to your point. That's a real life example.
Mm.
Never had a major death in his family. His transitions, for the most part, if he had to define it in life, have been smooth. This one took him by jolt. This was a surprise. It's one of those things that you call a complicated grief because it was sudden, came out of quote unquote nowhere.
Mhm.
And even his mom hadn't been through it like that, but he had me. So I was able to put together a toolkit for him, a foundation. And his father was so akin to grief, meaning that he didn't shy away from the death conversations. So
Mhm.
he would prepare him from the tactical side of it and from the logical side of it. And then he had me, stepmom, who had been there before, so I could provide a toolkit for him. And then he could navigate on his own with my support. So just a real live example there of really being familiar with it. So the last thing I just will say is don't run from it. I know it's hard. I know it's hard, but when you meet it, oh, on the other side of it, I tell you, the transformation is like no other.
Hmm.
Your relationships and your relationship with yourself becomes even more dynamic, and your self-awareness.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much. We are going to have you, Roz, join us for part two in this loss, grief, and transition conversation. Where can our listeners find you?
Oh, you can find me. So my website is rrichardprice.com. And so you will see a layout of more of my mission, my values, how I provide support and partnerships in the communities that I've built for people like us, Sharita, and for the people that you've described that have never
Mhm.
been akin to death in such the way that we have and loss. And then also to support others who are going through other losses that we're going to shift into when we talk about career, divorce. They can find me there. You can also find me on Facebook, Rosalind Price. You can find me on Instagram, Rosalind Price. I'm on Blue Sky. So just please outreach. And if you don't get support from me or even Sharita and your network, get support from somebody and become more savvy.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I thank you all for joining us for this episode. And remember to lead every moment. Thank you all and have a blessed day.